Hey everybody, some of you know me because we work together here in the Butler Building, others do not. My name is Brent Winter. I'm a writer and editor with University Communications and Marketing. We have a StateCom meeting coming up, I think most of you know that, and so they asked us to help put together a little slide presentation about UCOM staff and to give a few fun facts about yourself, one of which is how many years you've been here, and that's when I realized I've been here 8 years. Which is, you know, time flies when you're working extremely hard all the time, so they say. And so, you know, I don't know, I just thought I'd mention that. It's like when you get here and you feel like you're the new person, and then that feeling never entirely goes away, but I've been here 8 years, so it's weird. So anyway, today I'm going to be talking about, I don't know, people approach me initially to do something about copy or writing or something. I give presentations on that kind of thing a lot around campus. And then as people signed up for this presentation and I got a sense of who was going to be in the room and people actually asked for certain things to be addressed, one topic that really rose to the top is tone. And so I decided to make that a focus of what we're going to talk about. There's so many other things that I could talk about with, and people mentioned brand too. So that's why I went with this approach. We're going to talk a lot about using NC State's brand as a strategic guide for the voice and tone to use in writing that you produce here. And I know, of course, that everyone here works for CALS Communications, and I'm not losing sight of that fact, but what I say will be drawing on the NC State brand, and I think what you'll find is that the brand is flexible enough to allow for different colleges and units of the university to individualize their copy production and graphic design, video, everything else, to reflect the character of your unit while also standing on the foundation of the brand. We're going to have brief moments where I ask for questions after different sections of the presentation, and then I do hope to have time for Q&A at the end. So if you have questions, other than questions for things you just don't understand that I say that are confusing or whatever, please hold them until I ask for questions in the ends of the chapters, as it were, and then at the end of the presentation. So the first thing I want to talk about is what is a brand, because that's one of the topics that kind of confused me when I first came here. I didn't come from the marketing world like a lot of my colleagues in UCOM. I came from the publishing world. And so marketing and branding and all that stuff, not only did I not know anything about it, but I had kind of an icky feeling about it because I associated that with shady advertising practices that are trying to make us all dissatisfied with our lives so that we spend more money on things we don't need. But I also, when I came here, I learned that marketing is simply a way of talking to people who might be interested in what you have to offer, whatever that is. And if you're in a nonprofit world or a public agency world, then I think it's actually a really good thing to let people know the positive ways that you can benefit their lives. And in that way, as opposed to trying to generate some kind of dissatisfaction with your life, you're actually trying to set up a win-win situation where you've got something that they could benefit from, and then if they come here, you can benefit from that, and then it turns into this reciprocal energy exchange that is sort of a rising tide that lifts all boats. And so when you look at it that way, then all of a sudden a brand becomes a really powerful tool to help you talk to populations. And so I had to first wrap my head around what is a brand. And what I find is that the word gets used in two main different ways. The first way is as the set of guidelines that an entity uses to define the way it communicates. And so we've got a brand website here at NC State that we'll be taking a glimpse at later. And in that sense of the word brand, that's what that is. We have rules for editorial style, you know, whether to use the Oxford comma. Spoiler alert, the answer is no. A certain defined color palette. We have voice and tone guidelines that we're going to talk about, imagery guidelines, font guidelines. And so every large organization that has a brand will have a defined set of rules for how to implement that brand. But there's another way in which we're all familiar, I think, with the way the word brand gets used, which is the way an entity is perceived by others. And also reputation is sort of interchangeable with this sense of brand. So that when NC State undertook a brand refresh back in 2013, one of the first things we did was we pulled in an outside consulting agency and did a bunch of focus groups and surveys by phone and web and all that, just to find out what our brand was in the second sense of the term. How do people see us? Because however much we might want them to see us a certain way, the fact is they definitely see us a given way. And so we need to find out what that is and determine whether and how those two match up or diverge. And one of the crucial things we discovered from our outside consulting group is that there was a wide divergence in specifically how good NC State is in terms of the scholarship, the research, the technology, the quality of the students we have, and the quality of our faculty, and how good people thought we were. People had a tendency to view us as a safety school, kind of this more backwards cousin to better schools, and they inaccurately viewed us as worse than we really were. And so we saw that we had a gap to close. And that's when brand really comes into play in the way we're going to talk about it today. The whole point of a brand is to use meaning number one to influence meaning number two, so that the two senses of what a brand means merge into one, so that you've got people viewing you the way your brand guidelines want them to view you. And that's what we are all about at UCOM, and I think you all too, as communicators on behalf of CALS. And I can say that we have found we're able to move the needle. We undertook this brand refresh, and we set some very clear intentions for how we want our various audiences to perceive us. And then we implemented a wide variety of messaging strategies over a lot of years to try to get people to move from the way they saw us to the way we wanted them to see us. And that has happened. And then, of course, it never ends, but we have done better in raising our reputation in the various publics that we like to target. And one of the ways you can tell that is sometimes housing will let everyone know that we've got a problem getting all the first-year students in this year. Another term I had to learn when I came here is MELT, which is out of all the students that get admitted for a given year, not everyone is going to actually enroll and show up on campus on the first day of class. And so that fall off in numbers is called MELT, but our MELT is shrinking at NC State. So that when housing has been trying to allocate, when admissions admits a certain class, they have to kind of touch base with housing for how many incoming freshmen they can actually house on campus. And we've run into some problems lately because there's less MELT. More admitted students are actually showing up as enrolled students. And that's only going to increase over time. SAT scores are going up, weighted GPAs are going up, graduation rates are going up, retention rates are going up. We're just on an upward trend, not only as an institution across the board, but all our colleges and units. And our communications efforts are part of what's driving that. So NC State does have a defined set of brand guidelines in the sense of meaning number one. There's the website. I assume some of you have been there, and I assume some of you have not, but I just wanted to make you aware of it because there's a whole suite of tools and resources there to help you wrap your head around. So Brent mentioned a color palette. What's that all about? Or Brent mentioned fonts. What's that all about? Well, that's there, as well as the voice and tone guidelines that we're going to talk about today. There's a screenshot of what the website looks like for those of you who haven't been there. You can see at the top, it says copy guidelines there, the second item from the left in the nav. That's where the voice and tone guidelines are that we're going to discuss today. There's also a whole other topic that I could talk for a whole hour about called editorial style. I'm seeing grins from people who have walked those paths before. NC State's editorial style is based on AP style, so we don't use the Oxford comma. And there's about 100,000 other points of style that writers and editors need to be at least familiar with. So if you're interested in learning more about NC State editorial style, that nav item is the place to go. So voice and tone is what we're going to talk about. And so let's talk about voice. One thing I like to point out about voice and tone is that those terms, as we use them in referring to writing, are metaphors. They're drawn from the quality that we have as human beings, that we speak with voices, and our voices have tones. And so we're going to be drawing on that metaphorical character of what voice and tone are to try to understand what voice and tone are in our writing. I've met some of you and I haven't met all of you, but if I were to ask each of you to go around and say the quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog with my eyes closed, even if I don't know who's saying it, I would be able to tell a different person's now speaking, a different person's now speaking, because you each have different voices. Your voice is unique to you. And even if you sound kind of like someone else in the room or someone else that you know, still your voice is unique to you. And that is the defining characteristic of voice in writing. It reflects an institution's personality. You sort of need to be able to tell who an institution is. You need to be able to tell what kind of person, metaphorically speaking, an institution is based on the voice that it displays in its writing. And we're going to talk about specific ways to make that happen. But as soon as I bring up the word personality, I need to step back for a second and refer back to the brand. NC State does have a defined brand personality that applies across all its units. It's a set of human personality traits that we metaphorically use to describe NC State's personality. And there are 4 specific ones. NC State's brand personality is courageous, it's innovative, it's intellectual, and it's purposeful. We want all our communications, whether copy or not, we want our videos to do this, we want our graphic design to do this, to instantiate at least one of these traits at any given time, and ideally more than one. And we also want to make sure that everything we do does not contradict any of these traits. We never want to seem cowardly. We never want to seem backwards looking. We never want to seem stupid. And we never want to seem ineffectual, okay? So everything that I do, this is the main touchstone in my work that I do as a writer and editor for UCOM, is I'm always referring back to that brand personality. Does it sound intellectual? Does it sound courageous? And I want to pack as much of that into everything I do as I can. So voice reflects the institution's personality, which we've just talked about, and it distinguishes you from other institutions, just as each one of you has a unique voice. Each institution, if it's got a well-defined brand voice, should be differentiated from other institutions by that voice. One thing I learned about branding and marketing from the brand refresh process that I went through is that differentiation is the name of the game in brand marketing. Because every university is going to say, we're awesome, come here, come work here, apply here, give us money. If you want people to actually go to your university and give you money, you've got to stand out from the crowd. How do you do that? You've got to find ways to differentiate yourself. Of course, we've got an excellent College of Agriculture. We've got an excellent College of Veterinary Medicine. Not everyone has those things. So that's one way you can differentiate yourself. But another way is to define a brand personality that draws on your strengths and then make sure that all your communications speak with that differentiated voice that reflects your differentiated identity. And another thing about voice is, just like your own voice, it's relatively stable over time. So that NC State was courageous, innovative, intellectual, and purposeful 5 years ago when we completed the brand refresh. And we still are today, and we still are going to be 5 years from now. 50 years from now, it might change. It probably will in some way as the institution continues to change, as the state of North Carolina changes, the economy changes, higher ed's going to change. And so as people change over time, their voices will eventually change. You don't sound at age 70 the way you do at age 20. So we're going to update and return and refresh the brand periodically over the life of the institution. But over relatively short periods of time, it should be relatively stable. And that stability of voice is one thing that differentiates voice from tone. Tone, just as you always sound like you, but you sound different when you're cheering at a basketball game versus when you're maybe scolding a child who has spilled daddy's drink all over the floor, or when you are whispering words of affection to a loved one, or when you're really sad and you sound a certain way and you're maybe talking to people at a funeral. Your voice is always yours and people are always going to recognize it, but your tone changes to match the occasion. One way to describe that is that tone reveals your attitude toward the topic at hand and or the person you're speaking with. And so in the case of writing, it reveals your attitude toward the topic of the piece you're writing about or to the reader of the piece. So here are some examples of a tone that a written piece could have. It could be happy, with variant shadings being exuberant or joyous. It could be confident, with variant shadings being authoritative or assured. It could be sad, mournful, or elegiac, or it could be compassionate, comforting, and nurturing. And in my work in UCOM, and also just in terms of reading all the copy I read here, I've seen examples of all of these tones in various ways. When we win some major grant, we sound happy about that, and we kind of blend that with authoritative, like we're so psyched we got that grant, and of course we got it because we deserve it because we're awesome, right? And then confident is when a lot of our campaign communications, we want to sound really confident that we're a really excellent university and therefore we're so worthy of your money that it's a good investment to give to NC State or the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences. Sad happens when Bill Friday dies, or when, this is something I had to do a few years ago. We actually had a student in the Schema program, which I don't know if everyone knows about that. It's an international business school that we co-run with a university in France. We had a student in that program who was killed in a terrorist attack in Nice, France, several years ago. And it fell to me to help write and edit a piece that we published about that student. And so that was a new tone that I had never had to strike in any writing I'd done for my work. And it was the appropriate thing to do. And I had to kind of stretch my writerly and psychological muscles to bring a tone that I might use in my personal life to this work situation. But it was absolutely what was called for, so I just did it. And then compassionate, I don't know that that tone would come up a lot in our work, but I see it in student work. A lot of people who work with students and are trying to say things like, if you're feeling overwhelmed, come to the counseling center, come to the student health center, talk to a peer counselor in your dorm, whatever. That's an important way that you can sort of earn the trust of your audience. So as I said, stealing thunder from this slide a while back, the same voice strikes different tones for different occasions. So here are some examples of that. When you're sending a fundraising letter to donors, you're going to want to sound one way. When you're writing an in memoriam for a deceased student, you're going to want to sound another way. If you're writing web copy, touting positive economic impact, you're going to want to strike a certain tone for that. I think of that as kind of a boosterish tone. You don't want to come on too strong, but you definitely want to let people know, and what I'm always thinking about as state legislators, NC State is improving lives in this state in very concrete ways every day. Here's one example of how. And if you're writing a magazine article about research innovations, what I think of there, when I was a kid, I was a huge science fiction and fantasy nerd. And so what I liked about that was a sense of wonder and awe and possibility. And I try to bring that attitude toward this kind of writing. I want to have a sort of a gee whiz or a wow or a sense of wonder response in the reader. And so I try to bring that about with the tone that I strike in my writing. Or a news story promoting an upcoming arts event is going to have a different tone. Leadership response to a campus crisis is going to have a certain tone. So as you can see, there are many different possible tones as there are many different possible articles you could write. And so all I'm saying is be thoughtful about the tone you're striking to suit the occasion. And we're going to talk about some very specific tools you can use to help shape the tone of your writing later on. So it's shaped to fit the occasion. It varies from piece to piece, as I think I just made clear. And so here's wrapping up what voice and tone are and sort of the difference between them. Voice is who you are all the time. Tone is how you feel right now. When I think of it this way, that kind of clears it right up. NC State is always those 4 brand personality traits. How does NC State feel right now talking about this topic at hand? Okay, so building blocks. This is very concrete, writerly, technical stuff. Diction, or word choice. You can create a very different tone in your writing based on certain words you choose, and we all have choices. So, for instance, plank versus what? This is the audience interaction part of the presentation. What's another word for plank? And I don't mean the verb. Yes, that was my first one too. I get that example from a poet named Coleman Barks, who is the leading popularizer in the United States of an ancient Persian poet named Rumi. And Rumi is one of the most popular poets in the United States, despite the fact that he died about 1,500 years ago. And that's mainly due to Coleman Barks finding these old, ecstatic, mystical poems and sort of recasting them in modern English. He doesn't really translate them. He just takes some translator's very non-poetic translation and makes it a poem out of it. And he says, I can't really translate them because I don't know classical Persian, and in order to get that right, you have to know the difference between plank and board. And if that's not your mother tongue, you're not up on all those differences. But because this is our mother tongue, we know the difference between plank and board, and we know that one word is going to be more appropriate in one sense and one is going to be more appropriate in another. Large versus... Right, we're looking for synonyms, not antonyms. Yeah, gigantic, big, enormous, huge. There's a lot of words that you could slide into there. Which one is right? Depends on the tone you want to strike. Cheap versus... Right, this is great. Cheap versus shoddy, you want things to sound bad. Cheap versus economical, you want to sound like you're a good steward of your resources. What was the other one? Inexpensive, much more neutral. Make of it what you will. It just means it doesn't cost a lot of money. We're not making judgments here. Okay, those are all different tones you could strike. Run versus...
Execute.
I wasn't thinking of that meaning. We've got a IT nerd here, but that you're right. Yes. Sprint, dash, scurry, scamper, Let's look at some more higher ed specific ones. Donor versus... Anything? What was that?
Champion.
Yep. Supporter, more neutral. Donor means someone donated something. That's like you gave, probably money. Supporter is much more like you're just underneath kind of lifting us up. With money, maybe not. Discovery versus...
Innovation.
That's the first one I thought of. It's kind of hard to think of another one for that one, but if you try really hard, I bet you could come up with something. And those are situations I face, whereas if I've used discovery in one spot in an article and then I've used innovation here, or maybe just innovative, then I want to find another word to refer back to the discovery in paragraph 1, and I don't want to say innovation because I said innovative in the paragraph in the middle. It's a tough choice. Leading versus...
Guiding.
Or what about leading in the sense of an adjective that describes something that's awesome?
Winning.
Yep.
State of the art. Revolutionary.
Yep. In that reveals the fact that we're all in a Western culture where revolutions are generally seen as positive things. It's my understanding that in Asian countries that's very bad, so... But they've got universities too, so how do they communicate? They wouldn't say revolutionary. They'd come up with something else that's appropriate to them. One word that we're going to see later that's in NC State's brand platform is preeminent. And that's a word that we use a lot in UCOM to give that suggestion. Make versus...
Create.
Yep.
Craft, build,
Yep.
fashion.
Yep. I've used them all. Yep, build, construct.
Run.
If you said building in paragraph 1, you don't want to say build in paragraph 2. You want to say construct or make or raise, All about the tone. So here's a sentence that I've written and or read different forms of about 1 million times in my time here. We bring groundbreaking innovations to the marketplace. What's another verb that you might use in place of bring?
Deliver.
Yep. We create groundbreaking innovations to the marketplace. No.
Offer.
Yes.
I
I don't like it either, except in a given situation, it might be appropriate. I can imagine a hypothetical paragraph within which that would be right.
Yeah, like if you're thinking about supporting entrepreneurial processes, you haven't done it yet, but you offer these things.
Right.
But I still think it's So just forget that.
Well, like in PCOM, they talk about offerings a lot. That's a kind of a business speak. And so if it's a more businessy audience, then that might actually be something that they would respond to. We push groundbreaking innovations to the marketplace. That's something we like to say in UCOM because it's more metaphorical than bring, although bring's metaphorical too, because that usually means something physical, right? I brought this coffee in this room. If you're talking about bringing an innovation to the marketplace, that's already a metaphor. And then if you're talking about pushing it to the marketplace, that's even more removed from the physical act of pushing something. But we like the more forceful connotation that gives. We drive groundbreaking innovations to the marketplace. This is a favorite of our Chief Communications Officer, Brad Bolander. I already knew about Push, but I wasn't driving things to the marketplace till I came here and started working with him. He'll use that word in his copy a lot.
Is Melvin the truck driving gig?
I guess. So that's how you can use diction. Another tool that you can use to shape voice and tone is sentence complexity and length. What I find, and let me just offer this as sort of an important sidebar to what I'm about to say. People at NC State, and this is probably true all across higher ed, like to treat sentences as sort of Christmas trees that they can hang ornaments on. And the more ornaments are on the tree, the better it is. With the ornaments in this case being facts or dependent clauses or maybe even just a whole bunch of adjectives, you know. And all I want to say is there's a limit to how far you can push that. Because the longer a sentence is, or the longer a paragraph is, or the longer a web story is, the less likely it is that someone who's busy and distracted and preoccupied is going to read all the way to the end. So what leadership often says is we want to get this message out. We want to communicate this. And what my response sometimes is, if you make it too long, people aren't going to read it all, in which case you haven't communicated anything. It only gets communicated if they read it. And the longer it is, the less likely they are to read it. And I do have research to back that up, by the way.
Again, can you just say it?
Yes, I'll say it 50 times. No, because they'll stop listening after 20.
Maybe 5.
The longer any piece of writing is, the less likely it is the reader will finish it. I can also say, and there's research to back this up too, this is a whole other presentation that I give sometimes, the longer a piece of writing is, the less likely it is that people are to completely understand it. So that you can give someone a given piece of writing, ask them to read it, and then if you're using like heat mapping software online, you can track whether they scroll all the way to the end. If you want to test comprehension and retention, you can ask them to read it and then test them on it. And the longer it is, people reading all the way to the end goes down, people understanding the information correctly goes down, and people retaining the information after they finish reading it goes down. So that's why Benjamin Franklin was right when he said brevity is the soul of wit. And Strunk and White were right when they said omit needless words. I did, and there's a whole slide for that later. So your moment is coming.
I teach composition.
Oh, awesome. Well, same page. Okay. So let's get back to sentence complexity and length. NC State is a preeminent university. True statement. It's very brief, so there are situations when this might actually be a little too brief. But there are also situations when this is all you want to say, make your statement, get out. Okay? NC State is a preeminent public research university. You're giving more information. Compared to the previous sentence, it's probably good. You're giving a little more information, you're being a little more informative. But you're already preeminent public research university. That's a 4-word noun phrase. Already, we're starting to get a little bit in the weeds here for how long this thing can be. NC State is a preeminent public research university with 10 colleges comprising all major fields, as you know. So I wouldn't use this as part of my lead in a magazine article that I'm trying to get people to read because it's really interesting. There are times when that sentence is appropriate, I would say in certain kinds of recruiting materials, in certain kinds of donor materials, especially donor stewardship, because you want to reinforce the sense that people have made a good investment by giving to NC State. But this sentence is so long and complex that the more appropriate it becomes for those audiences, the less appropriate it becomes for other audiences. And then this one, which has so long it gets its own slide. And I have seen this sentence. NC State is a preeminent public research university with 10 colleges comprising all major academic fields and a cooperative extension service that provides evidence-based assistance to citizens in all 100, have to take a breath, North Carolina counties and the eastern band of Cherokee Indians. When I first got here, my job was what Deborah does, which is copy editing and layout for extension. And that sentence, pretty much verbatim, was on at least 50% of the extension materials that cross my desk. Can you vouch for that?
Yeah.
Okay. So, again, there are situations when that sentence is, I wouldn't say it's necessarily appropriate, but you kind of have to have it, you know? But deploy with care and intention. Only use it when you absolutely have to, because the number of people who are actually going to read all the way to the end of that sentence is vanishingly small. But they may be the people who are really important, like the director of extension, or the director of Cal's communication, or a major donor, you know? There are times when you've got to do things a certain way for a tiny little audience who's really important. And in that case, that kind of sentence is where that's the kind of sentence you tend to find. So that's justified. But it's not justified on your typical marketing piece, or like where you're trying to get people to sign up for Master Gardener classes, you know?
Hey Brent,
Uh-huh.
is there any indication that data supports that people would read like the first 5 words and then like the last 5 words?
I don't know to that level of detail, but that data is out there. And
It's like if it's really important to talk about the preeminent public research university, and for whatever reason you want to keep all that copy in the middle, but then you also want to highlight the Eastern Band of the Cherokee Indians, like those being your kind of bookends of importance.
yeah. Well, I will say later, this is a separate slide, that whatever comes at the end of a sentence tends to be emphasized. The reader places an emphasis on what comes at the end. They feel that what is at the beginning is what the sentence is about, content-wise, and they feel that what comes at the end is the most important part. So it may be that you're going to benefit from putting Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians at the end if that's where you want the emphasis to lie. What they may miss is the rest of the sentence. So you can make sort of a like a Faustian bargain. You know, you put the most important part at the end, knowing that they're not gonna read the rest, but you've put the most important part at the end, so you know that's better than nothing. Yeah.
Going back to what you were talking about, the heat mapping, if you're writing online too, people tend to read left in Western countries. They tend to read to the left and then down, like across the whole page. So that's another way to put it in front of their eyeballs. So, you know, so if you really wanted to emphasize the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indian service or something like that, then that might just need to be its own thing on the left. Because they're going to read down, across, and leave.
That gets to online usability, which is a topic I know something about, but not enough to give a full presentation on. But I can recommend a really good book on it. It's called Don't Make Me Think. And it's basically online usability for non-designers. And in this era of WordPress templates, it's information we can all benefit from. We're all putting stuff online at some point. And it helps if you know what the basic do's and don'ts of usability are. It's a really good book aimed at people who do not do that for a living. And I found it very helpful. And it also gives you chapter and verse to cite when someone wants you to do something that's bad usability. You can say, no, no, no. And Don't Make Me Think it says, don't do that. And that, what I find, this is like 40% of how I get anything done, is if you can cite chapter and verse for something in some way, people are like, oh, well, either you've convinced them or they're tired of arguing with you. So I use, style books that way a lot. I'm like, but if you see here it says, or I actually have a college composition handbook that I keep in my office. And if there's something that is wrong and I don't know exactly how to phrase the rule, I will go and find it and I will literally retype what the rule says in the handbook. And again, I've either convinced my interlocutor or I've worn them down because that gets me my way. So I offer you that. Another building block of voice and tone is syntax, which means word arrangement. And this gets back to what we were talking about with the end of a sentence. I omitted this part for length, but since we've already touched on it, I'll go ahead and say that whatever comes at the beginning of a sentence, people tend to interpret that to mean that that's what the sentence is about. That's going to be the main semantic content delivered to the reader. They look at what's first and say, oh, it's about this. And then what comes at the end is where the emphasis lands. It's the most important part of the whole sentence. So here's an example of how you can use that in your writing. Farmers turn to NC State when they need help responding to the effects of climate change. It's a true sentence, it's a straightforward sentence. It makes us look good. It makes us look like we're helping real people. You know, it's awesome. But if you want to put a different emphasis on it, you could rephrase the sentence by saying this: when farmers need help responding to the effects of climate change, they turn to NC State. I like that sentence better because it puts the emphasis on NC State. And I work for university advancement. Everything I do is constantly trying to advance the university and its various constituent parts. I'm all about NC State. So I'd rather not, I don't want to put the emphasis on the climate change, and I don't want to put the emphasis on the farmers. I want to put the emphasis on NC State. But I want to talk about how NC State is helping the farmers with climate change. And so the second sentence gets me there, I think, more effectively.
Question.
Yes?
Would you apply that same syntax idea to both paragraph and article structure?
I would say that syntax is very important in paragraph and article structure, but I think different rules apply. So, for instance, I don't think that what comes at the end of a paragraph is emphasized. I think that most paragraphs in most nonfiction writing, the final sentence functions primarily as a transition out of. I do believe that every paragraph, every well-written paragraph, is about a single contained unit of meaning. So each paragraph should have a coherent topic. And then there's another paragraph right after the first one. So it's sort of like, how do I get across the stepping stones there? And the last sentence of the prior paragraph usually functions mainly as a transition out of the prior one and into the next one. So what it's about is sort of less important than its rhetorical function. Sometimes you can make that bridge by about the content. If your next paragraph is about something similar, then you can mention it or sort of point to it in that last sentence of the prior paragraph. Or you can do it through just the rhythm of the sentence. If you're going to say, the last sentence could be, and that's how things were 50 years ago. And then the first sentence in the next paragraph could be, today, comma, things are much different. So you've set up a pleasing sort of point, counterpoint. And that's a way to make a transition. There's lots of ways to make a transition, but I think that's how the last sentence of the paragraph typically functions. But as you can see, we just talked about how the last sentence of the paragraph plays an incredibly important role. And in that larger sense, syntax is hugely important. And I would say that the same holds true at the article level. So let's wrap it all up. How to use a strategic voice and tone. You let the brand personality determine the voice. Who you are all the time. The voice emerges from that. Who do you sound like all the time, no matter what you're talking about or how you feel? That comes out of your personality. Let brand personality determine the voice. Let the occasion determine the tone. You're always you, but are you happy now? Are you sad now? Are you trying to get someone to do something now? Are you trying to prevent someone from doing something now? Are you trying to get money? Are you trying to get people to show up to a tailgate? Whatever it is, shape the tone to fit the occasion. And you do that through diction, sentence complexity and length, and syntax. Word choice, how long and complex your sentences are, and the arrangement of the words. And as the coup de grace, we'll finish up with Strunk & White's rule number 17. Let me say, this comes from Otis Strunk and E.B. White's Elements of Style. E.B. White wrote Charlotte's Web. He's awesome. This book is, there's a debate over whether it's outmoded. I think it's partially outmoded. I've taken another look at it since including this in presentations. I'm like, yeah, I probably wouldn't recommend about 40% of this book nowadays. But, and for one thing, there is a list of numbered rules to follow. And this literally is Rule 17. So modern audiences aren't going to respond to that too well. But I don't think Rule 17 will ever go out of style. It says, omit needless words in the intro to this. And then it says, vigorous writing is concise. A sentence should contain no unnecessary words, a paragraph no unnecessary sentences, for the same reason that a drawing should have no unnecessary lines and a machine no unnecessary parts. This requires not that the writer make all his sentences short. The gendered language is another way in which this is not so applicable to today. Or that he avoid all detail and treat his subjects only in outline, but that every word tell. And here's the most important part. Many expressions in common use violate this principle. Has anyone here heard of the book Story by the screenwriting teacher Robert McKee? No screenwriters in the room? Okay. Well, Robert McKee is an awesome screenwriting teacher, and in his advice about writing, he talks about how you need to dig down deeper than whatever's on the top of your head, because what's on the top of your head is going to be some cliche or some really stale, trite, overused idea or turn of phrase that you've heard a million times. And that's true of all of us. The cliche is the first thing that comes to mind. The overused thing, the overly wordy thing is what comes to mind. And so as communicators, we need to push deeper and don't use one of these expressions in common use. Omit needless words. This will never go out of style. And so that's all I've got. I have no idea what time it is. What time is it?
43.
Nice. Okay, so questions, comments, disagreements, discussion. We got plenty of time. Yes?
How will the coming new strategic university plan impact branding?
That's an excellent question. So you mean what's going to come after Pathway to the Future expires and we get a new one? I'm really glad you brought that up for a reason that you might not have had in mind. But I have a friend who is a co-owner of a software company in Durham, and he knows next to nothing about communications or writing or marketing. He's brilliant at other things. And we got together one weekend, and he's like, so how was your week? And I said, well, I gave a presentation on strategic use of voice and tone in writing. And he said, so what's that about? And so I just told him a little bit about this presentation. And he said, man, I want to have you come and talk to my guys because they have no idea what I'm talking about whenever I talk about strategy, being strategic. And so he just liked it that I was grounding everything I was saying in a brand strategy. And not that he cared that they would learn anything about NC State or communications or Strunk and White or any of that, but just to even have a strategic thought or to act strategically. That was something else I learned about when I came here. So the way it works at NC State is we have a strategic plan that guides the university's efforts overall. And then we look at communications as a tool to help implement the goals and objectives, to achieve the goals and implement the objectives of that plan. So we start with a strategic plan for the university, and then we base our strategic plan on what the university strategic plan wants to achieve, because communications at the beginning and the end of the day is just a tool. It's a vast toolkit that you use to achieve. It's a means to an end. It's a giant means to an end. And so those ends are set at the top level by the strategic plan. And then once we have a new strategic plan, we will probably devise our own new strategic plan at the UCOM level for what we intend to achieve and how we're going to implement the goals and objectives of the strategic plan at the university level. And then once we've done that, we'll take a look at the brand as it currently exists, compare it to our new strategic plan, which is based on the university's new strategic plan, and we'll say, how does the brand need to change to help us meet this new set of goals for the next 10 years? So how it will affect it in a more concrete and specific sense, I don't know yet. No one knows yet. We got to have a new strategic plan at both levels before we'll touch the brand. But my guess is that it'll change somehow. I don't see the approach changing much in terms of, courageous, intellectual, innovative, and purposeful. Some of those words might change, but not much. If you read a lot of the writing that comes out of UCOM, we favor this sort of concrete, punchy, pragmatic, think and do. It's all about the practical value of our research, technology, scholarship. we're improving lives across the state, throughout the nation, and around the world, and all that kind of thing. That's not going to change because we're a STEM school. And I don't see that ever changing. And that goes up to the state level and the university system level. I mean, there was sort of a deal struck decades ago where Carolina got the medical school and we got the engineering school. You know, that's always going to be the case. So given that, how do we position ourselves in the marketplace? We may refine how we position ourselves in the marketplace, and we may make brand adjustments based on things like enrollment goals may change. And you know, I don't know, the provost is going to have a lot to say about the new strategic plan because they're trying to shape both the student and the faculty profile in accord with certain goals that they're going to define. But we're always going to be, I mean, think and do, whether we keep that mantra or not, that's always going to be who we are, I think. And so the brand will always be pointed toward a set of goals congruent with that, that motto. Anything else?
What about the path of least resistance for getting non-communicators to buy into keeping things?
That was very well phrased.
Good communications here.
I wrote it down.
Getting non-communicators to do what, though?
To be open to changing, or our recommendations for changing some of their language related to our audience. So if, I'm going to throw Molly under the bus. So Molly is our new research communicator. So she's working with the North Carolina Agricultural Research Services Office and a lot of researchers. And they, even on externally facing pieces that aren't dedicated towards other researchers, they want to have very long, convoluted
Jargon,
jargon,
including jargon.
and you know,
It's long and it's convoluted and it's jargony.
Right,
That's three
right.
separate
Yes.
yet overlapping problems.
So, you know, do you have any recommendations of like how to kind of help them see the benefit in sticking with the university brand and being willing to shift their natural inclinations in that way?
Who's writing their copy?
They are, but then we're potentially editing it. And
What does
offering-
potentially editing mean?
offering recommendations, like if they have talking points or a presentation and they're like, okay, I want to let you look at this. And so you were looking at it and is this an unfamiliar thing for people? This is regular life for me. And you want to offer suggestions about how to improve it so that their audience is able to better understand and go with them on that path.
And this is for a lay audience, not a scientific or
Yeah,
technical
like the
audience.
scholars are they're so immersed in speaking to other scholars that talking to a lay audience becomes sort of an exercise in we become the translators
Yeah.
from academic use to we can understand,
Yeah,
I can understand
Yeah.
this.
lay audience. So they're writing for lay audiences even though they're not skilled or experienced in writing for lay audiences.
Yeah.
Do you want to hear an example sentence from a press release I was sent to make slight suggestions to?
Sure.
Cover crops are plants such as legumes, grasses, and brassicas that are grown to protect and regenerate soil and improve water, nutrient, and pest management. They are not typically harvested for cash income. One sentence.
And I'm not saying necessarily like change, but get them to be a little more open to the idea that a sentence like that could halt any potential audience members.
Yes. It might be worth your while to. So the issue here is research communication. How do you translate, as you put it, very technical material for a non-technical audience? When I was working with Extension faculty, and now in my work with some of the faculty I work with, there are some who sort of get it inherently that, oh, this is very technical and you're not very technical, so it should sound different. And some just don't, you know, like they don't care. And so all I can think of to say, it all comes back to the relationship, I think. You've got to establish a relationship that allows you to say certain things that they may not want to hear. And part of that is you've got to be diplomatic in saying things that they don't want to hear. I got started as a copy editor for a medical newsletter publishing company, and I've been doing a ton of editing in my career along with all the writing I do. And one of the first things I learned was that I've got to be diplomatic if I want to get people to accept what I'm saying. Like it's inherent in my job. I'm saying this sentence is not as good as it could be, and here's a change I want to make that you didn't want. I want it, and it'll be better. You've got to find a diplomatic way to say that over and over again. And so if you create a certain relationship that has the kind of trust and goodwill that allows you to say that kind of thing, then that can become your beachhead that you use to make further gains. So for instance, you can say, I'm glad you sent me that thing last week. I think we were able to make some good changes. Please feel free to send me anything in the future. I think your work is so important that I really want to make sure it gets out to the widest audience possible. You know, none of this is untrue, but you're spinning it a certain way, you're emphasizing certain things to create a certain result, which is, at the end of the day, you want to become that person that they send all their stuff to. And they get really used to being edited by you, and they get to where they like it, and they see the difference. And you've gotten across to them as using your relationship box, that's the conduit between you. It's like, okay, the relationship is open. Now I can say, technical material should not be sent to non-technical audiences. And they hear it. They don't reject it. It doesn't bounce off, you know? So that's not too much about writing or editing. It's more about office politics, I guess. But office politics has, from the very start, been a very important part of my job as an editor. And I think it's something that if you're ever editing anyone's copy, it's actually a crucial skill set you got to pay attention to. Another suggestion I want to give is that I'd be willing to come and give a presentation, not this one, but I mean, I give presentations on all kinds of topics all the time, on I don't know, like citing some of this research that I've alluded to about the longer it is and the more convoluted it is, the less likely people are to finish it, understand it, and retain it. You know, to help them to present in a technical way. Okay, I mean, this is scholarly research in rhetoric and composition published in peer-reviewed journals that proves what you say if you say it's too long. That might be language they can hear and could help pave the way for you to make some headway later.
Could I add a comment to that?
Certainly.
When I was, so my background is actually in marine science, and I, when I was in graduate school, we had a, twice a year we would have a weekend-long presentation boot camp, which is sort of analogous, you know, in that, like, you know, a lot of like PowerPoint presentations that you see scholars give are completely and totally inaccessible to a wider audience. And some of the professors in the college that I was a part of would actually come and do this presentation boot camp with us. And it was just the way that it was presented to us. The presenter would actually bring scientific material from a field outside of what we did and showed it to us. And so it was sort of analogous to, like, once you're outside of what, you know, your very narrow focus is, you also can sort of get subjected to this, like, inaccessibility.
Yeah.
And so some of these professors would see, like, presentations that were of different material but of similar format and structure to what they themselves were doing. And it was just completely, like, eye-opening. Like, I can't believe I've been giving presentations that, you know, have all of this dense material on it. And it was just sort of a matter of, like, putting yourself in your audience's eyes by, using a set of material that was not as like you were not as immersed in and as familiar with.
I'm so glad you said that. That's a fantastic idea.
Yeah,
I
that's
bet it
awesome.
really worked.
It did, yeah. And like the quality of the presentations that we would see faculty giving improved as a
Yeah.
result of it.
Yeah, I can totally see that. How are we doing for time?
You have 4 minutes remaining.
Okay. I was going to say one more thing before you said your thing. So I'll give you a set of phrasing to use that I've heard my colleague Matt Shipman use. He's the research communications lead for University Communications. I hear him. His office is right next to mine, so I overhear these tortured conversations with faculty sometimes. And what I've heard Matt say is, no, we're not dumbing it down. We are simply phrasing it in terms that everyone can understand.
I
Yes.
just was at a panel that he was on, and he said, think about it as finding common ground. So not even not dumbing it down, but what are the values that we have in common, and speak from those values, as
Mhm.
opposed to from the research or the finding, so that you can connect with that person, because the values that you share are gonna come out in a shared language.
Who was that presentation for?
It was a SciComm panel for, I think it was put on by the College of Sciences grad folks, but I did all that stuff. Also, yeah,
Okay, Matt Shipman
it was really good.
knows a lot, more than I do, about how to interact with troublesome faculty.
Yeah. The guy who writes the XKCD web blog, Randall Monroe, also wrote a book called like The Thing Explainer, which like it started from the he like took a blueprint of the Saturn V rocket and used only the like 100,000 most used words in the English
100
language to describe it, to like explain it. And so he was using words that are common and useful to, a 10-year-old and explained the Saturn V rocket, and then he wrote a book about it. So if you're ever thinking about
The
trying to
Thing
translate your material for a wider audience,
Or just follow his comment.
it's called the Thing Explainer. It's a book, and his name is Randall Monroe.
But also just follow XKCD.
Yeah,
His
XKCD.
comic,
Yeah.
that's all he does is SciComm with stick figures.
Yeah.
He's amazing. He was just on campus a few weeks ago.
We're out of time.
I know.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.